Well, hello, and thank you for tuning in to Truth TV News. I'm Vincent Rhodes, your host, and I wanted to talk to you today about Aries failure. Many people are not aware of Aries failure because it's one of the most hush-hush experiments that was done. But this experiment was done with light and the refraction of light to see whether or not the Earth is moving, or is it actually the stars that are moving. If it is the Earth, in fact, that is moving, then it would support that we do live in a heliocentric universe where we are actually rotating the sun. But if it is indeed the sun that is moving and the stars and the moon moving around the earth, then it would support a geocentric perspective. Well, this Aries failure seems to support more so the geocentric perspective, that indeed the earth is stationary and that the sun and the moon and the stars are actually the thing, or actually the sources of light that are moving around the earth. And this was proven not only by Aries, but it was also proven as well by another experimenter called Bradley, James Bradley, indeed, and Samuel Molyneux. And they got together, I believe, in December of 1725 to observe the skies and see whether or not the um, stars were moving or if it was indeed the earth moving. So I believe what they did, they took a fixed point in the sky and they focused on that fixed point. And through careful observation, I believe in March and also September, to see whether or not the earth was moving or was it the stars that were moving. To make a long story short, they found out that it was actually the stars that were moving and not the earth at all. And let me just read it to you so that you will know what was said. At the end of the 18th century, the heliocentric theory was generally considered self-evident. Only an empirical demonstration that would validate the theoretical accomplishments of Kepler and Newton was lacking. Standard astronomy history still holds and teaches that it was James Bradley who found the experimental proof that the Earth has yearly motion and that Copernicus was right. Careful analysis of the relevant data, however, shows that this is not true at all, but that on the contrary, Bradley's so-called aberration of starlight gave the first experimental disproof of the heliocentric hypothesis. To recall to mind the bare facts, the matter is this. If indeed the Earth moves in its orbit around the Sun, then the place from which we observe the star will be continually changing. Therefore, we shall see a nearby star as moving in a small circle against the backdrop of a more distant star. That's found in Figure 1. What is more, looking at such a nearby star A from point M, which is in March, there's a star, here's March, and here's September. And point S, September, and knowing the distance of September and March to be about 3 times 10 to the 8th power kilometers, we can, by means of triangulation, obtain the distance to A. Now Bradley found that Gamma Draconis indeed does describe a small circle with a radius of 20.5 seconds of arc. The problem facing him was how to explain this phenomenon. Did it indeed result from the Earth's rotation about the Sun, and hence relative to the array of the fixed stars? That is, did it show the parallax, or the movement he had hoped to find, or was the motion caused by the Sun and the stars circling with respect to the Earth at rest? Bradley was forced to opt for the first alternative, but then had to reject it, for Gamma Draconis did not circle against the backdrop of stars, but all the stars joined in the motion, which would imply that they were all at the same distance from the Earth. See, this is something that scientists tried to prove that the stars are different distances from the Earth, but he had to come to the conclusion that Bradley had to come to the conclusion that all of the stars were the same distance from the Earth. In other words, to accept the phenomenon as a parallax would mean reintroducing the discard medieval concept of stellium, a gigantic shell of stars centered on the sun, which revolved around us. Since this was considered to be impossible, because they just did not want to accept the conclusion, another interpretation of observational facts had to be found. So actually, the stars circle the Earth with the a fixed point right in the middle, which is the North Star, Polaris, and all of the stars rotate around Polaris, and that's what we observe. What they were looking for, however, they wanted to see if the Copernican principle and the ideas of Newton and Kepler, they wanted to support those ideas, which says that we live in a heliocentric universe. But what they actually came to discover, and they could not refute, is that we do live in a geocentric universe, just as the Bible tells us. Now, this came along. This idea was so profoundly rejected that they even wanted to reject the conclusions of it themselves. However, since this conclusion was inconclusive for them, they didn't really want to accept the actual results. They decided to do another experiment by trying to get a telescope and filling it with water and tilting it to see whether or not there was any refraction of light if they moved the telescope. And water has a tendency to slow the light down. So that's what they were going to do. This is when Aries entered in, and he took over from them. And I believe, let's see, now this experiment that they did, however, was done in the 1700s, which 1725. Later, another man came along whose name was Airy. He was in 1871, and I believe he lived between 1802 and 1892. He implemented what we popularly know now as Airy's failure because it affirmed the truth, Bradley's truth, and it did affirm Bradley's truth that indeed the Earth is the stationary point and it's a fixed point, as opposed to the Earth actually moving. The Earth doesn't move. The Earth is standing still, and the sun and the moon and the stars are actually moving. Because Aries, that what he did, he actually did get the telescope and fill it with water, and he performed an experiment to move the telescope. And while he was moving the telescope, he assumed that he would still be able to see the light refracted at about 5 degrees tilt. But he did not see the light refracted because, indeed, by moving the telescope, uh, you were um, you were distorting the light. Okay, so put simply, if I'm moving and I'm coming towards the light, my perspective of the light has to change the closer I get to the light. So if the earth is moving, and pretend that with this vehicle, the earth is moving. And so as the earth is moving towards the light comes directly overhead. And so this showed that the earth was not moving. When he fixed the telescope in one particular place and allowed the light from the telescope to enter into the telescope, he was able to see the light and it was able to reach the lens. And it proved that indeed the earth is in a fixed position, just as the Bible tells us that the earth is motionless, the earth is stationary.
Fear before him all the earth. The world also shall be stable, that it be not moved. The Lord reigneth, he is clothed with majesty. The Lord is clothed with strength, wherewith he hath girded himself. The world also is established, that it cannot be moved. Say among the heathen that the Lord reigneth. The world also shall be established, that it shall not be moved. He shall judge the people righteously.
and the Bible tells us that the earth does not move. But again, this experiment has been done over and over again. Even in Wikipedia, they record the experiment, but then they grossly distort the results of the experiment so that it does not show that Aries failed to show that the Earth is in motion, because the Earth is not in motion. As a matter of fact, I believe if you look it up on most of the Google, if you look and try to get Google results on it, I'm sure that the Google results are going to try to distort whatever truth comes out about this, because it does not support the heliocentric model. And again, the heliocentric model was set up again by people who saw the Earth as moving. And the reason they were doing that is because, again, when I get back to Emmanuel Swedenborg and some of the early thinkers, they supported an idea of a Big Bang and that the Earth is millions and millions of years old. And so this also supports the idea that of evolution. And so evolution has to be supported somehow. And this demonic understanding of the earth, or what we call the doctrine of demons, somehow has to be given rise. So in order to do this, these people reject the truth. Now, the scripture tells us very plainly that, when men reject the truth, they become fools, because they change the truth of God, which is evident to all of us, into a lie. And that's exactly what they're doing. You'll find people like Stephen Hawkins supporting the heliocentric model. And you'll find other people, like, again, people who support Charles Darwin, supporting the heliocentric model. And as a matter of fact, one of the most popular scientists who support the heliocentric model was Einstein. And this is why Einstein talked about the theory of relativity. Because in the theory of relativity, Einstein postulated that he said, well, if you were to, I believe it was a train moving past people, he said, it's just as easy to think that it's not the train moving, but it is the people who are actually moving rather than the train. So he says, really, motion is relative. And motion, it doesn't really matter whether or not what our perception of the truth is, because truth is always changing or relative based upon the position of the person and their relationship to the object which they're focusing on, which is a bunch of nonsense, of course. But again, it's important that I mention this to you so that you can kind of like come to understand why many of our scientists today are professing themselves to be wise. They become fools, and they're leading people into this form of foolishness. Anyway, I thought maybe I just mention that to you. What I would do is that this is a very long article. What I will do, I did my best to kind of explain it to you, but I'll leave a link in the description box. And if you would like to get that, get this article, then, or a link for this article, I'll leave it for you. Also, don't forget to visit my website and leave your email. That way I can get in contact with you and upload other research that I'm doing on a regular basis. Well, like, subscribe, or don't. But until next time, remember that Jesus is the light of the world, and the truth shall set you free.